In Irish folklore, they speak of a disembodied female spirit whose keening squeal is so deafening, it's like 1,000 fingernails scraping across a chalkboard. She is a sinister force of malevolence sent to warn you that death is on the way. This arbiter of terror is known as a banshee. Some believe that banshees are unnaturally tall, white-haired women of physical disfigurement, while some believe they are beautiful, sweet-singing virgins who died at a young age. But regardless of appearance, their message is clear. The cry of a banshee is a warning sign to all that death is imminent. In today's age, the word banshee has transcended its Irish heritage and become a way to describe any instrument of fear, power, and destruction. And in 1987, a motorcycle manufacturer would pay homage to the name of Banshee by building a machine so vicious it would etch its name into modern folklore as a motorized weapon of fear, the messenger of the abyss, the Yamaha Banshee. A 350cc two-stroke four-wheeled creature of destruction, often referred to as just the She, with two distinct headlights that resembled devilish eyes burning with infernal fury. A ferocious power plant that had a keening squeal deafening enough to send a warning sign of foretold disaster. A machine that offered the best thrill per bill spent and became the chosen vessel of empowerment for every weekend warrior looking to buy a front row seat to the abyss. A machine that was evil enough to almost claim the life of the Prince of Darkness himself, Ozzy Osbourne. And it would become the backbone of off-road humanity until governments from around the world went on a collective witch hunt to rob the masses of its sheer greatness. This made the Yamaha Banshee one of the most coveted four-wheeled weapons of all time. So in today's video, we'll take a look back at the massive impact of the Yamaha Banshee and why 18 years after it ceased production, it's still one of the most sought-after off-road machines that's ever been built. Let's face it, us humans love the dirt. We were born in it, we grow life in it, we play in it, and at some point, we're all going to return to it. So it's no surprise that since the invention of the wheel itself, we've gone to great lengths to build machines that will take us to the unknown and beyond. It's the fabric of our DNA. Two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, six-wheelers, hell, even just one wheel. If it has a wheel on it, we're going to take it off-road. And you know what else is woven into the fabric of our DNA? Our quest to push every boundary to the maximum and then beyond. Because whatever it is, it's never big enough, fast enough, or scary enough for us. And a few things in the off-road world could push the boundaries of performance and beyond, like the Yamaha Banshee. It was an apparatus of adrenaline, a machine that was built with a singular focus that can't be fully understood unless you had ridden it. And there lies the mystique of the Yamaha Banshee. Now, to grasp the true impact of the Banshee and why it's one of the most popular ATVs that had ever been made, with a die-hard loyal cult following, we have to understand why this machine was built in the first place and the time period that it was built in. And that time period was the 1980s. The 1980s were big. Big hair, big malls, big tensions, and big horsepower. It was a time before excessive EPA emission crackdowns, safety standards were subpar, and there wasn't a sprawling cookie-cutter community or no trespassing sign popping up on every piece of vacant land. There was always open spaces to open up big engines. And it may have been the last decade of sanity before we all became zombified technology muppets who communicate through memes and initialisms, but that's another story. Anyway, let's get back to the 1980s. Let's just say at that time, vehicular safety standards were not a top priority. And maybe it's because we were all wrapped up in the Cold War and the arms race. So there wasn't many safety regulations surrounding recreational vehicles. However, in the earlier part of the 1980s, high-profile news outlets like 60 Minutes started to feature negative pieces about the dangers of all-terrain vehicles. And ATVs started to become the it thing to slander. They became the outlet for a society to point their finger at and channel their anger towards. Now, there was in fact data suggesting that ATVs were more dangerous than motorcycles, but we'll get into that topic later. The point is, ATV manufacturers knew at some point in the future some sort of ban or decree would be enacted, and that would put pressure on future ATV sales, so they started looking for solutions. And the solution would come when Suzuki would bring to market the very first four-wheeled ATV in 1982 called the Quad Runner LT125. Suzuki marketed that Quad Runner as a safer alternative to three-wheelers. And at the time, that seemed logical that four wheels had to be safer than three. And because it was a new concept, there wasn't any data to suggest otherwise. So the quad became the perfect deflection tool for the manufacturers. They could slowly phase out three-wheeler production and get the angry mobs off their back while still being able to produce a multifunctional all-season all-terrain vehicles. And that was pretty much it for the trikes. From that moment on, every manufacturer basically ceased production of three-wheelers and started making quads. At first, these quads were docile, detuned toys, but by 1985, we'd be introduced to the first of the performance quads with the Suzuki LTR 250 and the Honda TRX 250R. These were the first of the high-powered ultralight monster quads, and up to that point, we had never seen that much performance packed into a production four-wheeler. Now, let's talk about Yamaha. Yamaha was way behind the ATV game. They didn't produce their first ATV until they released the 1980 Tri-Moto. This was a full decade after Honda released the first commercially mass-produced ATV, the infamous ATC 90. And by that time, Honda and Suzuki were already producing cutting-edge, high-performance quads, and Yamaha was releasing models like the Moto 4 and the 4Zinger. Also at this time, as a company, Yamaha had this fixation with Honda. They desperately wanted to surpass Honda as the top manufacturer of motorcycles and ATVs, and their business plan at the time was that anything Honda would make, Yamaha would immediately try to outdo them. So without a high-performance ATV quad in their lineup, this can't happen. So when Yamaha sees the success that Honda's having with the TRX 250 in 1986, they have to respond with their own high-performance quad. Now, the Japanese have always been good at what I call motor milking, and that's the art of making one motor and making as many different models from it as possible. It's a profitable practice because it's easier, faster, and cheaper to try to fit an existing engine into a chassis rather than designing one from scratch. Yamaha's original plan for the Banshee was to fit the YZ250 two-stroke engine into the chassis, but Yamaha felt that they were just matching the 250cc entrance from Honda and Suzuki, and that wouldn't steal enough market share. They had the engine from the YZ490 race bike, but that engine was air-cooled and it hadn't been updated practically since its inception in 1982. And it wasn't very reliable either. Also, most racing organizations were starting to phase out 500cc two-stroke motocross bikes, so none of those engines would really work for them. However, they did have the ultra-potent RZ350 two-stroke motor that they used in the street bike lineup for the RD and RZ models. Now, these were big sellers at the time for Yamaha, so they had sunk a ton of R&D into those engines. Customers loved that type of engine output, and it had been proven fairly reliable up to that point. Also, it just so happens to be at that time when it came to street-based machines, the EPA was on the warpath by implementing new emission regulations that would ultimately put an end to street-based two-strokes. Because not only did we have the threat of nuclear war hanging over our heads in the mid-80s, a group of scientists informed us that we have this big giant hole in our ozone layer, and at any time we might get fried by the sun's rays and evaporate to dust. So there was like a little bit of panic going around. So anyway, Yamaha probably has a plethora of these 350 engines just laying around. So it seems to make perfect business and performance sense to use that motor. But there's an issue with this. The Honda and Suzuki 250s are rolling off the floor with about 30 to 35 horsepower. And while the government might be naive towards quads, the manufacturers are not. They know exactly what it is they're building. And even though the word isn't out yet in the media, the manufacturers can see the data. And they know that these new high horsepower, high performance quads aren't the safest things they've ever built. Now, 30 horsepower in today's age may not sound like very much, but in those days, it was, because there was no fly-by-wire throttle or any kind of electronic interference to save you. It was more of a relationship that you had with you and your throttle. If you were on good terms, you survived. If you couldn't see eye to eye, you died. That's just the way it was. But the problem for Yamaha here is that the RZ350 engine produces a whopping 59 horsepower. And they realize they can't send this thing out like that. So they detune the engine down to the mid-30s to push it through the red tape and claim that it's a competitor to the Honda and Suzuki 250cc's. But they know, and everyone else knows, it's not. But neither party at this point cares. It's like the space race. Who can build it bigger and better? Safety is an afterthought. This is full-on quad wars. And in 1987, Yamaha releases the Banshee on the public and the games begin. It doesn't take very long for the customer to realize just how easy and cheap it is to unlock this monster from its cage. For a few bucks, you can port the cylinder, throw in some high-performance reeds, mod the air box, and a few other small things, and you now have yourself a 50-horsepower quad machine. And that's what a finely tuned Banshee could produce, in excess of 50 horsepower. They could reach speeds close to 100 miles per hour with the right gearing. And let me remind you again that this is a machine that didn't have any electronics. There was no software to save your ass. It was you and the throttle. And again, hopefully you two had a decent relationship. Otherwise, you were toast. And while common sense would tell someone that this is just way too much horsepower for an off-road application, the demonic power of the Banshee overrode such judgment and logic. I mean, let's face it, you don't go out and buy a 50 horsepower machine like this just to use 30 of it. You buy that thing to use all of it. And if there's any more that you can extract from that engine, you're going to find it, and you are going to use it, because pushing the limits is everything that we represent as a species. And because of all of that, Yamaha sold every Banshee they ever made, and it became the arch nemesis to the mighty Suzuki WideZilla. And over the next several years in the off-road community, it was all about Banshee versus Zilla. It was an all-out horsepower war between the riders of each brand. It was like a scene from The Fast and the Furious, minus the Mack truck heisting and grand theft. But at the time, it was all about who could build the most insane quad and back it up in a drag race at the dunes, a large field, or a long straight somewhere. In stock form, the Yamaha Banshee could do 0 to 60 in about 4.5 seconds, and a modified one could get into the 3-second range, which was faster than a 1987 Corvette that did 0 to 60 in 6.3 seconds, and it even had a faster 0 to 60 time than the 1987 Porsche 911 that did 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. And that's pretty impressive, considering that in 1987, a Corvette would cost you $27,000, a Porsche 911 $37,000, but you could grab yourself a Banshee somewhere at about $3.5 grand. So to think that you could accelerate faster than a high-performance sports car on a dirt road for a fraction of the cost is where life starts to take on a different meaning. And the Yamaha Banshee allowed the average Joe and Jane to feel superhuman, even if it was only for just a moment. And as I had said earlier, any machine that produces that type of power will definitely leave the disrespectful and overzealous rider in a world of hurt. But brute power wasn't the only concern when it came to the Banshee. It was a hard quad to ride for the untrained. The Banshee did not do slow. You had to know how to slip the clutch and spin the motor to get the most out of it. And it required a ton of shifting. You had to keep that motor in the power band, otherwise it ran like crap. This meant it wasn't the ideal weapon for tight spaces in woods. The Banshee needed wide open spaces, otherwise it just boiled over and fouled spark plugs. Also, jetting the machine correctly was a task, some rear shocks were defective, and the airbox design was crap. So when it really came down to it, the Banshee had a temperamental power band, had to be spooled up close to 8,000 RPMs to extract the demonic power from the engine, it overheated in slow terrain, jetting could be finicky, some riders complained about the poor performance of the rear shock, there was no way to tell if the air filter was installed correctly, some of them were not reliable, and a story came out every week where somebody was getting annihilated by this machine. So the Banshee was only good for one thing, and that was straight line power. But do you think that stopped anyone from buying it? Hell no. If anything, it made people want it even more. Because that's what we're all about. Taming the untamable, wielding the unwieldable. The mountain must be climbed, the sea must be crossed, and of course, the Banshee must be ridden. And if you've ever rode one, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. So was the Yamaha Banshee dangerous? Well, of course it was. But was the off-road weekend warrior who thought they could handle the power of a high-performance quad any more dangerous than the high-profile doctor, lawyer, or business person who thought they could handle the power of a Porsche 911? No. In my last video about the Suzuki Quadzilla, I posted this cornucopia of statistical data in reference to how dangerous ATVs are. And you can watch that video. I'll put a link down in the description box. But for this one, I don't think it's necessary, because every bit of statistical research I ever do about safety hazards for recreational vehicles always returns the same conclusion. And that's that most serious injuries are caused by rider error from inexperience, intoxication, a combination of both, or just being an unfortunate victim of circumstance. It's almost never the machine's fault. But you know how we are. When bad things happen, we often refuse to hold ourselves accountable, and we start pointing our fingers for something to blame. And the Banshee became the hunted. Numerous injuries, lawsuits, and stricter EPA emissions put pressure on not just the Yamaha Banshee, but the entire ATV industry. Sales across the board for all manufacturers began to decline significantly. But even with government restrictions and declining sales, Yamaha stayed involved in the ATV game. While the other manufacturers had pulled back a little bit, Yamaha would go on to build a series of high-performance four-stroke quads with the Yamaha Warrior, the 660 and 700cc Raptors, and the YFZ 450. And the Yamaha Warrior actually became the best-selling sport quad of all time. But unfortunately for humanity, Yamaha would cease production of the Banshee in 2006. Now, they claimed the reason was because of strict EPA standards, but a more accurate description is that sales for high-powered quads were declining and four-stroke engines were starting to take over off-roading. But the Yamaha Banshee, along with the Suzuki Quadzilla, were the dinosaurs. And the EPA, the lawyers, and the overzealous public were the asteroid that sent them towards extinction, but only in production, certainly not in the hearts of its followers. Because if you go to any off-road event or any race anywhere in the world, I assure you, you will see somebody on a Yamaha Banshee. Go up into the YouTube search bar and type in Yamaha Banshee, and you'll see a plethora of videos about people who are pledging their lust for this machine. Oh, it's alive and well. And for a machine that's been out of production for 18 years, to have that demand still should tell you everything that it was all about and what it meant to off-roaders and the unique riding experience it offers. To say that they don't build machines like this anymore is an understatement. They never built machines like the Yamaha Banshee before it, during it, and certainly not after it. And at the end of the day, isn't that what life is all about? It's about the experience. Because let's be honest, life is stressful. It's one big cesspool of redundant traffic, strip malls, high taxes, long working hours, processed foods, escalating prices, weird people, and shitty jobs. And sometimes the only thing that can get you out of bed to endure one more day of this hamster on the wheel insanity is your release. That one thing in your life that brings you peace. That one thing that gives you refuge in the midst of chaos. Because it's in the darkness of that chaos that we truly find ourselves. And a machine like the Yamaha Banshee could take you right to the edge of that chaos. Let you get a good look of who you are and what you were made of. And every once in a while, that's exactly what we need. Now back to Banshees for just a second. One of the interesting things about the Banshee myth is that only the person who the message is intended for can hear the Banshee's cry. Nobody else can. And what a perfect name for a machine that did just that. That could deliver a message that only you could hear, that only you would understand. But instead of imminent death, it brought eternal life. Long live the Yamaha Banshee.